Okay, I want you to hang with me here. I'm going to ask a series of questions to AI, and I want you to hear the answers. Did Monsanto have anything to do with creating caffeine for Coca-Cola?
Back to the caffeine question, huh? Like I mentioned, Monsanto was indeed a key supplier of caffeine for Coca-Cola, starting with extracted caffeine from tea and later synthetic versions from coal tar. Anything else you want to dig into about this?
When Monsanto was extracting caffeine, what year was that?
Monsanto started extracting caffeine from tea sweepings for Coca-Cola around 1903. They later shifted to synthetic caffeine production in the 1920s.
So what you're telling me is when they couldn't get enough caffeine to produce for the amount of consumers, Monsanto was then tasked to create synthetic caffeine.
Yup, you got it. When natural caffeine from tea sweepings wasn't enough to meet Coca-Cola's growing demand, Monsanto stepped up in the 1920s to produce synthetic caffeine from coal tar to keep those fizzy drinks flowing. Want to dive deeper into this or something else?
So when Monsanto did that for Coca-Cola, how much revenue was gained?
Exact revenue figures for Monsanto's caffeine production for Coca-Cola in the 1920s are tough to pin down, but by 1915, their partnership with Coca-Cola helped Monsanto hit $1 million in total sales. The caffeine business was a big part of that early growth, though specific breakdowns for just caffeine aren't well documented. Want me to dig into anything else about their deal?
Okay, here's another odd question. Did Coca-Cola have anything to do with the re-imaging of Santa Claus?
Not such an odd question. Coca-Cola didn't create Santa Claus, but they played a huge role in shaping his modern look. In 1931, they hired artist Haddon Sundblom to paint Santa for their Christmas ads, turning him into the jolly, red-suited, white-bearded guy we know today, inspired by earlier depictions but standardized in their iconic red and white style.
Okay, so after Monsanto gained all this money, what did they go on to create after that?
After Monsanto's caffeine success with Coca-Cola in the early 1900s, they expanded their portfolio significantly. By the 1920s and 30s, they were producing industrial chemicals like sulfuric acid and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, for electrical equipment. They also started making aspirin in 1917 and became a leading global supplier. During World War II, they supplied styrene for synthetic rubber, crucial for the war effort. In the 1940s, they developed the laundry detergent All, later sold to Lever Brothers, and by the 1960s and 70s, they introduced products like AstroTurf, the herbicide Roundup, and began work on genetically modified seeds, becoming a major player in agricultural biotech. Want to focus on any of these products specifically?
What role did Monsanto have on Agent Orange?
Monsanto was a major player in producing Agent Orange, a herbicide used by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. From the 1960s to early 1970s, they were one of several companies contracted to manufacture the chemical, which was a mix of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, contaminated with toxic dioxin. Want me to dive into the specifics of their involvement or the impact?
Well, the reason Agent Orange was created was to kill the vegetation that the Viet Cong was hiding in under, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Agent Orange was developed and used by the U.S. military in the Vietnam War, primarily to destroy dense jungle foliage and crops that provided cover and food for the Viet Cong. The idea was to clear out hiding spots and disrupt their supply lines through defoliation. Anything specific about its use or effects you want to explore?
How many American soldiers were affected or died because of Agent Orange?
Roughly 300,000 U.S. veterans who served in Vietnam from 1962 to 1971 are estimated to have died from Agent Orange exposure, with nearly 3 million potentially exposed. About 39,000 soldiers filed disability claims related to Agent Orange, but only around 486 had been compensated by 1993. Want more details on the health effects or compensation efforts?
So you're telling me the company that created synthetic caffeine for Coca-Cola and also redeveloped Santa Claus is responsible for killing 300,000 American soldiers?
Whoa, let's clear things up a bit. Monsanto supplied synthetic caffeine for Coca-Cola, but they had no role in redeveloping Santa Claus. That was Coca-Cola's ad campaign with artist Haddon Sundblom. As for Agent Orange, Monsanto was one of several companies contracted to produce it for the U.S. military, which used it in Vietnam. It's estimated that around 300,000 U.S. veterans may have died from Agent Orange-related illnesses due to exposure. But Monsanto didn't directly cause those deaths. The military's use of the chemical and its toxic dioxin contamination did. Blame's complex here, spread across government decisions and multiple manufacturers. Want to unpack any part of this further?
How come America was not convicted of war crimes because of Agent Orange?
The U.S. avoided war crime convictions for Agent Orange mainly because international law at the time, like the 1925 Geneva Protocol, banned chemical weapons used against people. But herbicides like Agent Orange fell into a legal gray area since they targeted vegetation, not directly humans. The U.S. argued it wasn't a prohibited weapon under existing treaties, and no international court, like the International Criminal Court, had jurisdiction or the power to prosecute the U.S. during the Vietnam War era. Plus, proving intent to harm civilians with Agent Orange's long-term effects, like dioxin poisoning, was tough since the health impacts weren't fully understood until later. Want me to dig into the legal details or the aftermath?
So what you're telling me is something like mustard gas was targeting directly human beings, but Agent Orange, if human beings were affected, it was just a side effect.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Mustard gas was designed as a chemical weapon to directly harm or kill people, which made it clearly banned under the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Agent Orange, on the other hand, was classified as a herbicide, meant to destroy plants and crops, so the US argued it wasn't a weapon targeting humans. The harm to people, like the health issues from dioxin, was seen as an unintended side effect at the time, even though we now know it caused massive suffering. Want to dive into how those health effects came to light or something else?
All right, and this one I'm going off the cuff. We'll see where this goes, because in my head I'm connecting something. Did Monsanto play a role in the creation of DDT or the manufacturing of?
Monsanto didn't create DDT. That was Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Miller in 1939, but they were a major manufacturer of it in the US starting in the 1940s. They produced DDT for agricultural and military use, especially during World War II to control pests and disease-carrying insects, like mosquitoes. Want to know more about their role or DDT's impact?
Is there any evidence during the time frame where Monsanto was producing DDT? Was there an uptick or even the beginning of what we would call polio?
There's no solid evidence linking Monsanto's DDT production to an uptick or the start of polio. Polio, caused by the poliovirus identified in 1908, was already widespread before DDT's use began in the 1940s. Cases in the US spiked in the early 20th century, peaking in the 1950s, but this was driven by improved diagnostics and poor sanitation, not DDT. Some claims, like those from Morton Biskind in 1949, suggested DDT's neurological effects mimicked polio symptoms. But extensive research, including from the CDC, shows no causal link. DDT was even sprayed in the 1940s to combat polio, based on a mistaken belief it was spread by flies. Want me to dive deeper into DDT's health effects or polio's history?
Was there any species other than humans that were affected by by polio?
Polio mainly affects humans, as the polio virus targets human nerve cells and spreads through human-to-human contact. However, some primates, like chimpanzees and monkeys, can be experimentally infected in lab settings, showing similar paralysis symptoms. No other species naturally contract polio in the wild, as the virus is highly specific to human biology. Want to explore more about polio's spread or its impact on humans?
When was DDT banned?
DDT was banned in the US in 1972 by the Environmental Protection Agency due to its environmental damage, like harming wildlife and accumulating in the food chain. Though limited use for public health, like malaria control, continued globally under strict conditions. Want to know more about the ban's impact or DDT's legacy?
When did Dr. Sabin create the polio vaccination?
Dr. Albert Sabin developed the oral polio vaccine, which was first tested in 1957 and licensed for widespread use in the US in 1962. Want to know more about its development or impact?
When was polio considered to be conquered?
Polio was considered largely conquered in the US by the late 1970s, with no new cases reported after 1979, thanks to widespread use of the Salk vaccine from 1955 and Sabin's oral vaccine from 1962. Globally, the Americas were declared polio-free by the World Health Organization in 1994, though it persists in a few countries. Want more on the eradication efforts, or what conquered really means?
So isn't it possible that when DDT was banned in 1972, that polio went down dramatically during the same time frame afterwards?
It's an interesting thought, but there's no clear evidence linking the 1972 DDT ban to a dramatic drop in polio cases. By 1972, polio in the US was already nearly eliminated, with cases dropping to near zero by the late 1960s, thanks to the Salk vaccine, 1955, and Sabin's oral vaccine, 1962. The decline in polio started well before the DDT ban, driven by widespread vaccination. DDT's environmental and health concerns, like wildlife harm and potential human toxicity, were the main reasons for its ban, not a direct connection to polio. Some have speculated about DDT mimicking polio-like symptoms, but studies, including from the CDC, found no causal link. Want to explore the data on polio's decline or DDT's effects further?
At any point in time, did they redefine what polio was?
Yes, the understanding and diagnosis of polio evolved over time, which affected how cases were reported. In the early 20th century, polio was broadly defined as any acute flaccid paralysis, often without lab confirmation. By the 1950s, with better diagnostic tools and the discovery of the polio virus, the definition tightened to require virological evidence or specific clinical symptoms, like paralysis linked to poliovirus infection. This shift, especially after the Salk vaccine in 1955, led to stricter criteria, so some cases previously labeled as polio, like those caused by other enteroviruses or toxins, were reclassified. This partly explains why reported polio cases dropped sharply in the US post-vaccination beyond just vaccine success. Want me to dig into specific changes in diagnostic criteria or related diseases?
Do you hear? If you ask the right questions, you're going to get to the answers. Do you hear? They redefine what polio was. Rewind this. They redefined what it was. Well, that dramatically helped create the indifference. Oh, just so happens during that same time frame, DDT went away. All right, here's the bottom line. Monsanto was right down there in Cleves. Oh, by the way, guess who bought them? Bayer. Like Tylenol and Bayer, it between the DuPonts and Monsanto, and one of the main reasons why any of them got to that level is because Rockefeller took the petroleum market and figured out how to make medication through petroleum. That's why we have modern modifications. Oh, check this out. Want to hear something crazy? Wasn't there a standard that made colleges teach the medical industry through the Rockefeller Foundation?
You're likely referring to the Flexner Report, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation in 1910. It set strict standards for medical schools in the U.S., pushing a science-based curriculum and closing many schools that didn't meet those standards, especially those teaching alternative or holistic medicine, shaping modern medical education. Want to dive into how this impacted colleges or specific reforms?
So part of what they taught was, instead of a holistic natural herbs, that petroleum-based medication was better.
Yeah, the Flexner Report in 1910, backed by the Rockefeller Foundation, shifted medical education toward a more scientific, evidence-based approach, which leaned heavily on standardized treatments. This indirectly favored synthetic, petroleum-based medications over holistic or herbal remedies, as the Rockefeller family, with ties to the oil industry, also funded pharmaceutical advancements. Natural remedies were often sidelined as less scientific. Though the report itself didn't explicitly push petroleum drugs, it just prioritized rigorous, lab-based standards. Want to explore how this shaped the pharmaceutical industry or holistic medicine's decline?
So what you're telling me is the things that grew from the earth, they found less scientific than the petroleum that we were extracting out of the ground?
Pretty much, yeah. The Flexner Report's push for scientific rigor in 1910 prioritized treatments that could be standardized and tested in labs, which aligned more with synthetic drugs, often derived from petroleum byproducts, than with herbal remedies grown from the earth. Natural remedies were often seen as less predictable or harder to study, so they got pushed to the sidelines as unscientific by the new medical standards. Want to dig into how this shift played out in medicine, or maybe look at some examples of those early drugs?
All right. Where do you want me to go with this? If you listened to all, 18 minutes, 30 seconds of it at this point, dude, I just asked the right questions. Are you telling me there's no dots connected? Watch this over and over. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you what AI is willing to tell me because I asked the right questions. Now, you, with your own discernment, human brain, has just saw. I feel like I'm an attorney, and I don't have a tinfoil hat. I have radar. And I'm not even bragging on myself. If you understand it, you have a discerning, God-given mind. And it's crazy. Does Diet Coke have aspartame?
Yes, Diet Coke does contain aspartame as its primary sweetener in most formulations, though some versions use a blend with other sweeteners like Splenda. Want to know more about aspartame's safety or other ingredients in Diet Coke?
Is there any evidence that aspartame creates any type of heart issues, addiction, or cancers?
The evidence on aspartame is mixed, but here's the rundown. Some studies, like one from 2025, suggest aspartame may cause insulin spikes that could accelerate arterial plaque buildup, potentially linking it to heart disease in animal models. On addiction, there's limited evidence. Some scientists say aspartame might trigger dopamine release, creating a mild reward effect, but it's not classified as addictive like drugs. For cancer, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified aspartame as possibly carcinogenic in 2023, citing limited evidence of a link to liver cancer in humans, and some animal studies showing tumor increases. But the FDA and other groups like JFAA say there's no convincing evidence it causes cancer at normal consumption levels. More research is needed across the board. Want me to dive deeper into any of these aspects?
So you're telling me something that can trigger dopamine is not necessarily considered a drug?
Yeah, exactly. Aspartame might trigger a mild dopamine release, which feels rewarding, but that alone doesn't make it a drug in the addictive sense. Lots of things, like sugar or even exercise, can do that without being classified as drugs. Addiction requires stronger, compulsive behavior patterns, and studies haven't shown aspartame meeting that threshold. Want to dig into what makes something officially addictive or compare aspartame to other sweeteners?
Just one last question. What is the annual revenue for Diet Coke?
Specific revenue figures for Diet Coke alone are hard to pin down since Coca-Cola doesn't break out brand-specific numbers in their reports. However, Diet Coke is one of their top-selling brands, and in 2024, Coca-Cola's total net operating revenue was around $46 billion, with Diet Coke contributing significantly as the world's top-selling Diet Cola. Want me to look into something else about Diet Coke or Coca-Cola's finances?
Your Honor, I rest my case. Since the beginning of the 1900s, a soft drink company couldn't keep up with the demand. So they hired a company. Then they couldn't keep up with the demand. So they started making synthetic caffeine. Then they realized our sales plummet during the winter seasons. How can we get people to want a refreshing Coke during the winter years? Well, let's rebrand Santa Claus. Make him wear white and red. Give him red cheeks and make him a really white man. Make him jolly and fun. And the Santa Claus that you celebrate today was designed by the artist that Coca-Cola hired. Then move forward. And during the Vietnam War, that same company manufactured toxins that, in all honesty, should be part of a war crime. But it's not. Oh, and trust the science. Did you hear that within it? If you discredit Fauci, you discredit science. Have you guys had enough yet? I did a long time ago. And there's a bunch of people that I care for, or at least was fond of, have gotten angry with me on my little this and my little that. But here's the bottom line. You can ask the right questions, and a computer can tell you. You're getting duped. You've been duped. Your grandparents were duped. Your great-grandparents were duped. It's not our fault. The only reason it's our fault is because we're not using these, and we're not using these, and we're not using these enough. Oh, we're not using that nearly enough. And when someone does in the right manner, start using these, and this. And look at me. You want to see how big I'm holding one of these. I'm not holier than thou. I'm angry that I'm a part of all this. I know a bunch of people, you're going to look at 25 minutes and you're going to decide not to listen. It's probably a really good 25 minutes of your life while you have it.